Okay, so we're recording. I'm going to kick it over to Mary Oldham from the Value Chain Cluster Initiative. Thank you to everyone who's here. And Mary, take it away.
All right, thank you everybody. Welcome to the webinar, Capture the Impact of Your Work in West Virginia's Local Food Systems. Wanted to thank everybody that came today and took time out of your day to participate in this. We had about 50 participants register for this, which is really exciting. Also wanted to thank our planning team. A lot of work went into this to pull this webinar together. Thanks to rural support partners, the Value Chain Cluster Initiative and NCIF, the Food and Farm Coalition, AceNet, Downstream Strategies, Central Appalachian Network, Unlimited Future, and we're using the WealthWorks framework today. This webinar was made possible through funding by the USDA and the Appalachian Regional Commission. We did want to say that this webinar is being recorded and we will send it out after it's completed. Next slide, please. So the objectives of the webinar today are to understand our collective interest in tracking food system impacts in West Virginia, to explore tools, best practices, and lessons learned for impact metrics and tracking, to build capacity at the organizational level and build the collective capacity to participate in a collaborative effort, although participation in the West Virginia pilot project is not required to participate today. It's optional. We also want to set the direction, including expanded indicators for the West Virginia Impact Tracking Project. So we hope that there will be something on this today that's applicable to everybody, even if you're not working in local food systems. Next slide, please. So Liberty, I can't see the current slide. Okay, there we go. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
That's great. Today we have Liberty Newberry-Fetty from VC2 operating the software here, and Gabby from Food and Farm Coalition is monitoring the chat box. Because we have so many people, we're going to hold questions until the end, so please type them into the chat box so we don't lose them. This is Mary Oldham with the Value Chain Cluster Initiative. I'm going to kind of give an overview of the pilot project, and then I'm going to turn it over to Andrew Crossan from Rural Support Partners, Leslie Schaller from Appalachian Center for Economic Networks, or AceNet, to kind of give the content of the webinar. And Annie Stroud from Downstream Strategies and Gail Patton from Unlimited Future are also going to provide some of the content today. So next slide, please. So to give a little bit of background on where this training came from and the collaborative impact tracking pilot project, this effort kind of evolved out of an effort that's been in the works since late 2016. We held an event in Charleston where we brought in Andrew and Leslie to talk about how they'd used the WealthWorks framework for measuring impact through the Central Appalachian Network. And that was kind of a way to explore if we wanted to do something similar in West Virginia and how to do it. And we learned through that gathering that there was interest and people were interested in contributing to that effort. So after that gathering, through the aggregation and distribution working group, a few of us in our organizations kind of nudged the effort forward to develop a pilot project around this. Next slide, please. So we were particularly intrigued to do this in West Virginia because we really saw it as a way to highlight the resilience and the interdependence of our work in local food systems. And we learned from Andrew and Leslie that that is really critical for communication with stakeholders and in advocacy. We also realized that it can provide a collective foundation for us all to measure progress and build upon together. And what we measure tends to guide our work. So it's important for us to measure what matters. Next slide, please. So a few of our organizations kind of stepped up to spearhead this effort moving forward, including the Food and Farm Coalition, VC2, Unlimited Future and Downstream Strategies, and also Patty Miller from the Aggregation Distribution Working Group has been integral in this as well. And we set the pilot project goals to improve individual organization and collective network ability to evaluate and communicate progress and impact. We also wanted to produce a short and practical annual report that Food and Farm Coalition and all participants could use to talk about the impact of our work with stakeholders. Next slide, please. So what did we get done in 2017? West Virginia Food and Farm Coalition agreed to be kind of the holder of the data and information as our statewide organization, and VC2 and our other organizations are playing basically support roles. We assessed interest and needs via calls and surveys, and many of you participated in that effort. We collectively prioritized the scope of the pilot project effort. We identify the metrics that are already being collected out there and metrics that people wanted to collect in the future, and what support and training people needed. And then we launched the pilot project survey in May 2017 to collect 2016 data. Then we've been revising and developing the infographic with the planning team to kind of report out on what we learned, and the Food and Farm Coalition's taken the lead on that. And then because of what we learned during the pilot project, we enlisted the Central Appalachia Network to provide some additional training support, which is how we got here today. Next slide, please. So the pilot project, what kind of participation did we get in this first year, and what lessons have we learned so far? These two graphics are in draft form. Like I said, West Virginia Food and Farm Coalition has been pulling these together, and we've asked for some support from AceNet to kind of hone the message a little bit. So these are in draft form and not ready to share yet, but they will be soon. We ended up tracking 3 metrics based on the metrics that we learned people were pretty much already tracking. We tracked gross sales, number of counties impacted, and total producers served. We had 14 different organizations or food hubs that participated in this. And we see here that we tracked over $1 million in gross sales going back to producers. There were over 1,000 producers served and over 31 counties impacted by the organizations that participated in this pilot effort. So as you can see, that shows impact and sort of the work that the network is doing, and is powerful to show that local food movement is an economic driver in the state. And we also know that this is basically only the tip of the iceberg as far as the impact that's being had, because there are many more organizations that we'd like to see participate in this out there. Through this pilot project, we also learned some things that will shape it moving forward. We learned that about some challenges that organizations and hubs are facing with being able to collect data and measure the impact. Many organizations and food hubs wanted to participate, but they were not currently collecting the data, or felt that their data collection or evaluation methods weren't working for them as best as they could. Another thing we learned is that different organizations are collecting data about the same metrics in different ways. So to have a collaborative project means something, we needed to make sure we were comparing apples to apples. So this webinar seeks to provide some guidance on best practices to collect data to make sure we're counting the same things. So even if you choose not to participate in the collaborative project, we think that it's valuable for individual organizations to have a good methodology. Next slide, please. So next steps for this pilot project, like I said, we're going to be revising the report based on the initial year and circulating that. We're also going to be expanding the project going into 2018. So we're going to launch the survey for 2017 data collection in early February 2018. And we're going to make some changes and improvements going forward. We plan to expand the scope of the project to add in recommended opt-in indicators based on what we learned today. We're going to be providing a toolkit to help organizations with their own metrics tracking, and that's growing out of this webinar as well. We're also going to be providing talking points for you to use in communication with stakeholders. Next slide, please. Okay, so how to engage moving forward. Can you go back, Liberty? Oh, thank you. One thing you can do is participate in this year's survey and encourage others to do so. We hope that more organizations will participate so we can show even greater impact that's happening out there. You can provide feedback on what would be useful training to you in order to participate in this effort. Definitely open to that and want to provide that support to individual organizations. Please join us for webinar 2 on January 16th, which is next week. And if you're interested in learning more about this pilot project or getting involved, feel free to contact one of our organizations or Gabby Scrifano here at West Virginia Food and Farm Coalition. And we hope you'll participate. Thank you. I am going to, next slide, please. All right, with that, that's kind of an overview of the pilot project. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Andrew at Central Appalachian Network and Rural Support Partners.
Many of you are familiar with the Central Appalachian Network, but CAN is a regional network of networks, and we're currently anchored by 7 nonprofit organizations that work with partners in 5 states within Central Appalachia. So the 7 anchors right now are ACENET, Appalachian Sustainable Development, or ASD, Coalfield Development Corporation, Community Farm Alliance, MESED, Natural Capital Investment Fund, or NCIF, and Rural Action, our sister organization here in Ohio. Andrew Crossan is our support person. So I think, representing CAN and certainly my organization, ACENET, we're really excited about the potential of this project in West Virginia. I think many of us as the anchor organizations within our network, and certainly working with many of you as partners within the sub-regional network, have identified how important measurement is. It really makes the case, the information that we know that local systems work. We're also, I would say, in many ways, being good stewards of the work that we do on the ground and the impact that it has throughout Central Appalachia. So we have the possibility to really let our funders and other decision makers know what's happening. And many of our partners like the Appalachian Funders Network, the Sustainable Ag and Food Systems Funders, the Appalachian Regional Commission, and the USDA, they've been strong investors in this work for many years, many decades. So we want to show that regional momentum. Appalachia's local food systems are definitely driving economic impact. Family farmers, small businesses, we're all seeing improved health and certainly overall increasing the resilience within our rural communities. So when you look at some of the metrics that we've been collecting through WealthWorks since we had foundation funding from the Ford Foundation and other partners in Central Appalachia, we've been collecting really a variety of different forms of capital. And we started in 2009, we've continued on into 2017, and we'll be collating and releasing some of that 2017 data here soon. So acreage of farmland, I think that's a big one, certainly in many of our communities. I know there's a lot of buy-in in terms of some of our partners in West Virginia wanting to see those sorts of metrics counted. So moving on, Liberty, I don't want to lose time here. Let's go on to the next slide. A lot of this information is also available on the cannetwork.org website. So some of the things that we've seen, that needle shift happen from 2009 to 2016, In 2009, just in terms of individual capital, when we're measuring producer revenue, we had 96 participating producers. Now, by 2016, we're measuring the impact of 953 participating producers. Probably still sometimes challenging capturing some of that annual revenue from folks, but we have some great market partners that help us do that as well. So the takeaways, obviously, these are pretty impressive numbers. We recognize that some farmers are making a living. You know, a number of the farmers that we're surveying are being able to go from maybe income patching to self-employment through their farm operations. And really, we're still in the very early stages, folks. We're just scratching the surface of what the true economic impact is. So we all know that we can do a better job, and there's better ways to aggregate this data. Moving on to the next slide. You know, these buyer purchases are also pretty phenomenal. In 2009, we were recording information from 51 wholesale buyers. By 2016, we were up to 160 wholesale buyers. So that's a jump from, you know, under $2 million in 2009 to almost 11 million in purchases in 2016. I think, you know, the big challenges are still getting information from some of the larger buyers, especially the wholesale retailers and institutions, as many of us have been able to secure deeper commitment from those market partners. I think that they're more open to sharing that data. But obviously, there's a big pathway to scale here. You know, we need to create more consistent demand, and we need to figure out how wholesale works, especially throughout Central Appalachia. I think we all recognize within our own communities that it's really demand that continues to exceed supply. So there's a lot of opportunities, but oftentimes as we develop these local food value chains or even regional logistics in terms of local and regional food distribution, we've got to come up with new models, and we've got to figure out how to embed the metrics as we start to prototype these new patterns, new changing of purchasing behaviors, especially by wholesalers. So moving on to the next slide, Liberty. So financial capital, I think for funders, you know, this is certainly an important investment. Certainly from, I would say, even the point of view of the market partners and the producers that we're all serving, looking at how many entities have made investments and the minimal jump perhaps of that investment. But I think we're still learning that in terms of people growing their farm operations, many of the folks that AceNet works with in Ohio are processors who are sourcing more from local farmers and growing their businesses. We're seeing more self-sustaining opportunities here. There's a little less reliance perhaps on grant funding, although for all you funders who might be on the phone call, we still need your targeted investments. There's probably a much greater variety of investments. Many farmers have been able to optimize a lot of the USDA programs that have been able to allow them oftentimes to invest in infrastructure. And obviously throughout Central Appalachia, there have been strong partnerships to create collaborative space for local food value chains to prosper. So this is talking about grown to scale. And I think these are the things that, again, we're making a case for these metrics because we'll be able to demonstrate the relationship between the investment, particularly in infrastructure, particularly in market and distribution development, to the economic impacts that we're seeing throughout the region. So moving on, Liberty, to the next slide.
Another piece of data that Ken has been tracking that we want to highlight is another piece of individual capital, again, impacting individual families and people, and it's about jobs and employment. And this one is kind of a no-brainer because everybody's interested in it, but it actually wasn't one that we started out tracking. So you'll see here that the first year we started collecting this data was 2012 and through to 2016. And even in that short amount of time, we've seen some pretty impressive growth. We measured fractions. We did fractions for full-time equivalent. So the numbers you see here are full-time jobs. All of the part-time jobs are in there as fractions. So in 2012, we had just over 390 year-round jobs and 593 total jobs. So that includes seasonal. And by 2016, we were up to 797.5 year-round jobs and 964.5 total jobs, including seasonal. So, so again, what this tells us is that we're impacting all those folks in the local food system are impacting over 900 people in terms of jobs and employment. This matters to just about everyone, just about every audience. You can't find somebody who doesn't care about jobs, from politicians to your Aunt Susie. Everybody's talking about jobs. So this one really matters. This is also a really tricky one to track because farm employment, especially for smaller scale farms, doesn't look like employment in other sectors. So it's pretty tricky. This is only what we were able to track. And it just begs the question, what is the real regional impact on jobs? I mean, we can measure about 1,000 jobs here. Surely the real number is many times greater than that. Next slide, please. So this should be the data trend slide. Again, y'all seen this already. The reason I bring this one back up is we just talked through, Leslie and I talked through several of these, and you can see the growth of the years of, say, number of producers, total producer revenue, number of buyers, total buyer purchases, investment, employment. But then these last two, acreage and financial stability, you'll see that we didn't talk about those, and that they don't go all the way to 2016. And the reason for that, if you go to the next slide, evaluation lessons learned, the reason is that you have to sort of improve these systems as you go along. So these are our lessons learned, and the first and most important thing is to go into this sort of data collection work with open eyes, recognize that it is extra work. Measurement doesn't just happen on its own. It takes extra time and energy and attention. So having a coordinator, if it's a multi-organization effort, really helps. And having a shared framework really helps, so that you're not having to figure out what to collect, how to collect it, how to talk about it. So having everybody have similar tools to use has really helped CAN, and I think it really helped this West Virginia group. Also, efficiency is really important, right? This is extra work already. It can be very laborious if it's not done efficiently, and so it's really important to be looking for ways to streamline and standardize the process. Every time you improve the process, you'll be grateful the next year. It's like a teacher with their lesson plans, right? The first time you write the lesson plan, it's a lot of work, but every year you do it, it gets better and better, and you get smoother and smoother with it. Same thing with these data collection protocols. So always be thinking about ways to streamline and standardize. Also, use what you've already got. There's no reason to build this thing from scratch. There's a lot of pieces of data collection system out there already. And one of the main pieces, and this is one of the evolutions that CAN has focused on, is to use transactional partners. That's our language for any sort of entity or actor who is already tracking sales and buyers and producer numbers. So anybody who is selling, who's intermediating between producers and buyers, or offers a platform that farmers are selling through, like a farmer's market or a food hub or a retail store or anything like that, those sorts of folks are already collecting some data. So use what they've got and give them the tools to help adapt their existing numbers to these evaluation frameworks, rather than building a whole new system from scratch. On the personal side of things, you all know everybody on this webinar is either a farmer or works with farmers. Farmers are private folks, and they really value trust and loyalty, and that really needs to be respected. So building relationships with a lot of care and sensitivity, and then being really sensitive around this data, because you are talking about people's businesses and livelihoods at the end of the day, and so trust is really, really important. And then, to the point from the previous slide, we stopped collecting a few indicators. And I think that folks have this misconception that what you set out to do, you have to stick with it. I think that folks generally feel feel pressure to do what they said they're going to do, even if they realize it's not working. And so what we realized is that there were a couple different ways we were collecting data that just weren't working. They were too much effort. They weren't giving us the results that we wanted. And to use the producer financial stability indicator as an example, we didn't have a good way to collect that. And so what we did is we did surveys every year, phone interviews with 15 to 20 producers, asking about their business finances, and to try to understand sort of the state of farm financial stability regionally. And there were three problems with that. One, it was a lot of time and energy and effort. Two, it was a really tricky conversation because that's very personal information. And then three, it wasn't a large enough sample size to where we could really say that we were getting clear answers. And so we stopped doing that. And I think the takeaway here is just to remind folks that this is about meeting your needs at the end of the day. So don't keep any part of an evaluation framework that doesn't make sense for your capacities and interests. And the very last lesson learned here, and I'll see what Leslie has to add, is that numbers are important, especially for certain audiences. Everyone likes to be able to name a statistic that describes the growth in the local food system or whatever else it may be. But those numbers are fairly meaningless without human stories and faces and anecdotes attached to them. So you can tell the story of a small farmer who maybe only made $10,000 selling through a food hub, but with that $10,000 was able to expand their business or hire a new employee or whatever else the story may be. That brings a lot of power to those numbers. So always be thinking about what the story or anecdote is behind the numbers. So let me pause there, see, Leslie, what you would add in terms of CAN's lessons learned about evaluation?
Well, I think, many people on this call have heard me say this before. I mean, this is challenging work, and it takes sometimes years and decades to really develop that strength of that network where trust is so embedded in all of our transactions. But what I like to constantly remind myself as, I guess, a sort of nonprofit person, we oftentimes as practitioners, I think we have to honor the work that's being done by the farmers, the clients, in our case, the incubation tenants that we serve, and really being able to animate the numbers in a way that gets at the deeper truth of the stories within people's lives and the changes that are happening, not just maybe for individual farmers, but that are happening within communities. So figuring out, certainly in this age of social media, how we can all do a better job really animating these metrics, I think is very important. So no matter what our hats, funder, practitioner, farmer, processor, wherever we might sit, hopefully we're all eater owners within our own local value chains. We all have a story to tell, and we've got to figure out how to do a better job animating these numbers.
Great.
So a little bit
Thank you,
of
Leslie.
feedback. So just want to ask everyone to please check your phone, make sure you're on mute, unless you're speaking. Thank you. Are you all ready for the next slide?
Yeah, next slide, please. So all of this that we've been talking about so far is basically what has been done already. We heard about what the West Virginia pilot project has been doing. And we heard about what CAN has been doing for the last 6 or so years in terms of collective impact evaluation and data tracking in the local food system. But the next section is really why we're all here, right? That's all well and good to hear what other folks are doing, but this next section is about how everyone on this call can actually start to implement their own evaluation framework to whatever extent makes sense, and then where we go from here collectively as a group. So we're going to be talking about metrics. We're going to be talking about which metrics make sense to collect, both for individual organizations and collectively. Why those metrics? Why are we choosing those and not others? And then how do we actually go about collecting that data? So we'll talk about all those things, but the first thing we want to introduce just real quickly is we keep referencing this framework and these forms of wealth and these forms of capital, and that actually comes from a national framework called WealthWorks. So if you could go to that slide, Liberty, and Leslie's going to talk a little bit about the WealthWorks framework and that national network that CAN is a part of.
Well, WealthWorks has been really pretty fascinating, I think, for those of us who are anchor organizations in CAN. A lot of it has really been developed as we were developing our metrics for the 8 forms of capital. So now, in its evolution, you can see from the map that there's lead organizations at a national level, also representing networks of networks that are assessing, planning, and evaluating the community wealth building strategies in all these different rural regions. So we've been having pretty much in the last 5 years, maybe 6 years, if memory serves, annual gatherings where we share best practices, understand how using this framework is really having economic and social impacts within our rural communities. And now CAN has emerged as a regional hub. So we're providing coaching and technical assistance to other organizations, other networks, primarily in Central Appalachia, but we do a lot of work nationally with these other partners as well.
Yeah, so you're going to hear us talk a little bit about forms of wealth and forms of capital. And as Leslie mentioned, there are 8 different forms of capital, which we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on that piece of it today. That's sort of the conceptual framework behind all of this stuff. But definitely let us know if that's something that you'd like more information on. There's a lot of great resources out there, and we could do some follow-up around those different forms of wealth. But could you go to the next slide? This is the evaluation matrix. So this is just, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but this is just to give a sense of how you start to build out an evaluation matrix. And we're going to have basically done this by the end of the webinar, but you could do this for anything, for any sector, for any things you were trying to measure. And basically the way that it works, if you look in the left-hand column here, those are your desired impacts. Those are the actual changes that you want to see. So if you're working in the local food system, you're trying to see impacts like more local food producers, growing local food economy, more wholesale retailers buying regional products, stronger networks, you know, et cetera, et cetera. These are the changes that we want to see. They're fairly big picture. And they're also not always easy to count, or it's not clear what you would count. So the next column here in the middle is the indicator. And that's what we're going to be talking about mostly today, is how do we actually measure these desired changes? When we say we want to have a certain impact, what are we counting? What are we documenting? What are we tracking to show that we're actually having that impact? And so you can see if it's something as simple as more local food producers, well, that one is fairly straightforward to count. You count the number of producers that are participating. For the growing local food economy, you got to pick something to count there. And so we would pick, say, sales revenues to the producers who are participating in this local food system. Wholesale retailers, you want to look at the number of buyers and the amount they purchase. If you're looking at something like strong networks of local food system actors, there's lots of different ways to think about how do you measure relationships. That one's not as simple as counting a set of numbers. So we've done things like draw maps that show the different relationships and connections between the actors. So those are just a few examples of how you connect an indicator to an impact. And then the far right column, you can go a step further and connect up to the form of wealth. So when you're making these changes and you're counting these indicators to show progress, what form of wealth is that building in the community? So again, there are these 8 forms of wealth that we listed on the previous slide. Most of them show up here, but individual is one that shows up a lot. That's about the impact that you're making for an individual person, a family, a business. That's a direct change for a specific person or group. Intellectual is about changes in the ways people think. So patterns, decision making. Intellectual capital is what we refer to as shared knowledge. And in this case, it's the shared interest of wholesale buyers in understanding the value of local foods and of them prioritizing local foods in their purchasing. Social capital is all about relationships and trust, right? So that's the connections that, say, all these actors across West Virginia have with each other, an incredible network there, an incredible amount of social capital that y'all have built up over the years. Natural, that's all about natural resources, assets, air, water, soil, things that are important to a community as well, but are difficult to measure in direct financial terms. So we would measure things like acreage. Financial, you heard about, that's the actual dollars usually. So savings, investments, things like that. And then the one way down at the bottom, political capital. That's the ability of a group to raise their voice, to have influence, to be heard, to influence decision making, to get policies enacted that are supportive of the work. So there's been some incredible examples of this in West Virginia, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. So next slide, please. This is the metric recommendations slide. So our goal here is to talk through some different metrics that first and foremost should be valuable to the individual organizations or entities that are on this call to understand their own impact. And so if this stuff isn't useful to you at an organizational level, then it's not going to be useful. So that's the first thing that we've got to make sure we do. And then the second thing is that we also think that these indicators that we're going to talk through here are going to be a good fit for collaborative work. So for this statewide impact tracking pilot project that you all heard about at the beginning of the call and that many of you participated in, we think that if there are multiple groups across the state all collecting similar data, then it makes it a lot easier to add it all up and say statewide, as the West Virginia local food economy, look at what we're accomplishing. One other note is that when we're thinking about all these pieces of data and what we're tracking and everything else, at the end of the day, we need to be thinking about who we're sharing that with and what they want to hear. And different audiences need different meaning attached to those numbers. Numbers don't necessarily speak for themselves. So funders, for example, who are often funding support organizations in this space or helping to incubate small farms or things like that, they want proof of the impact on things like jobs and livelihoods and business growth. Policymakers and federal funders, they want stories about economic growth. They want to know that this is a job-creating sector. They want to know that it's a growing economy because that's the language that they speak. So they need things framed to them in those terms. Farmers are another really important audience that maybe we don't think about first when it comes to impact tracking, but really they're critical. Farmers need to understand that they are part of a sector that is growing and thriving, that's economically viable, right? They're not on a sinking ship. They're on a rising tide that's lifting all ships, to use that overplayed metaphor, and that there's a growth opportunity, right? So it's really difficult to attract farmers into a local food system if you can't say to them that there's demand for your product out there. So that's one of the things that we can say because of the data that we've tracked. We can show farmers that producers are increasing their revenues year to year, that purchasers and retailers are increasing their demand, they're increasing their purchasing year to year. And so what that says to a farmer is that there's business opportunity in this sector. And then the last group, which we shouldn't forget about, and we are all in this group, one way or the other, are consumers. Consumers want to feel good about their impact. They want to feel like they're participating in a local economy. They want to feel like their dollars are making a difference and their choices are making a difference. So being able to say to West Virginia's consumers, here's what you're supporting in terms of small farms, in terms of local economy, local business, sustainability, all those things, that helps to motivate consumers to continue to make purchases, decision-making that are oriented towards local food. I also want to note that we're going to, on the second webinar, which is scheduled for next week, we're going to do a much deeper dive into sort of the intangible aspects of all this stuff, the norms, the guidelines for how you go about collecting the information, for how you communicate about it, for how you talk to different audiences, for how you manage those numbers once you have them in order to preserve trust and relationships with the farmers and with the audiences that you're sharing the data with. So we'll be spending a lot of time on that next week. And this week, we're going to focus on the indicators themselves. So next slide, please. So here, these are the actual metric recommendations that we're going to tackle here today. And most of these you've already heard about, and they're either from the original pilot or they're ones that CAN has tracked, or both, and a few are new. And so we're going to talk through each of these. So we're going to talk through producer revenue, participating producers, food hubs and intermediaries, employment and job creation, buyer purchasing, community engagement, and then some additional ones that we're going to go through as sort of optional add-ons, food access, farmland conservation sustainability, and financial investment and viability. So for each of those indicators or metrics, we're going to talk about a few different things. We're going to say, what is the indicator? And the indicator is the countable, measurable thing that we're actually going to track, right? So what is the number that we're going to track? Who does it make sense for? So not everyone's going to track everything, but certain organizations are really well positioned to track certain things. And so we'll talk about who that makes sense for. We'll talk about how it's collected. What is the actual method for gathering that data? What's the process? Things like that. And then what does it show? So what's the form of capital that each indicator or metric is contributing to? And what is the message that you're sharing based on that number? What is the message? What audience cares about that number? So without further ado, let's launch into the first metric here, which is producer revenue. If you can go to that slide, Liberty. So for producer revenue, and this is what we'll do. This is what we'll do for each of these metrics. First thing is the indicator. So producer revenue, what are we counting? The indicator is what we're counting. So for producer revenue, we're counting gross sales by producers. So gross sales, that's the total amount that producers sell, right? We're not counting expenses. This isn't profits. It's not after taxes, because that just gets more complicated. So gross sales, total revenue coming back to producers. Who does it make sense for? So this probably makes sense for any transactional entity, which is to say any entity that is buying or selling that intermediates between producers and markets. So food hubs, farmers markets, retailers, small stores, growers groups, anyone who is aggregating and selling produce or who is providing a platform for farmers to sell. Because these actors probably are all tracking some version of their sales already, right? This is just the first thing that you would track if you were doing any sort of sales would be what your sales volume is. And so these are a number of different types of actors who probably already have some version of this data and could adapt it just slightly to fit this evaluation framework. How do you collect it? We would suggest that you collect it as annual total gross sales. So over the course of 2017, for example, how much did you sell total through your entity? So if you were a food hub, what were your total sales for calendar year 2017? If you're a farmer's market, how much was sold at that farmer's market through the calendar year 2017? If you're a small retail store, how much did you sell? And so the benefit of that is that it's aggregated data. And so it's anonymous. So farmers don't have to worry about any of their personal information coming out because you're reporting it as the entity, as a transactional entity, as a food hub or as a store. There's a whole other category of sales here, direct sales, which look a lot of different ways, on-farm sales, produce stands, direct sales to restaurants, things like that. Those are much more difficult to track because there's not a central entity that's already collecting it. That's farm level data, and probably only the farmer has that. Now, there's a lot of great data out there. That's a whole nother level of economic impact that's happening, but it's much more difficult. So that requires additional surveys or outreach or things like that. And so we would suggest starting with the transactional entities, starting with this aggregated data, and maybe having the direct outreach to farmers be something that it might be considered at a later time because it is just so much more complicated. So the takeaways for this metric for producer revenue, it impacts both individual and financial capital, right? So it's about individual farmers and businesses and money going back to them. It's also showing viability. It's showing financial viability in the sector. It's showing viable livelihoods and sector growth. And last thing for this category is that this is where you can let farmers know that they are they're helping the big picture by contributing their data to this data collection process. So by being part of this data aggregation, they're helping to support future resources, future policies, future advocacy efforts, future infrastructure investments. All these things that are going to lift up the local food system rely on farmers sharing their information. And of course, that's usually done anonymously, but if a farmer is interested in having their story told and they've got a powerful story to tell, that should always be an option as well. So I think we've got a good West Virginia example here that Mary was going to talk about.
Sure. I'm unmuted, I think.
You are.
Great, thank you. All right, so producer gross sales. We actually, as you saw in the earlier slides, did track this one for the pilot project last year. And mostly we chose this as one of the indicators because of that very reason that Andrew said, that a lot of people are already tracking this. So, you know, for the pilot project, we chose to work with these transactional partners or these market partners running stores like the Wild Ramp or Swift Level Meats and Highland Market, to name a few that can readily provide aggregate sales data and wanted to participate. So these transactional entities. So as I said earlier, the gross sales captured just in that first year of the pilot project were over $1 million, which, as I said, is just the tip of the iceberg. So we definitely are seeing the impact there. And I think Gail, were you going to also speak on the slide?
Yes, I was. The Wild Ramp is in Huntington, and we were able to contribute to this gross sales number. We did $322,000 in producer sales in 2017. And we can break that out, of course, by individual producer, which we don't share, but we can also break it out in terms of like all the producers from West Virginia, and those producers sold X number, all the producers from Ohio. So we know that the Ohio producers that we work with sold a total of about $70,000 worth of stuff during 2017. We can total our meat sales, we can total produce sales. So having a good point of sale system works really well. Even though we work with over 150 producers, we can break out a lot of different categories about those sales.
Okay, great.
Ready for the next metric, Andrew?
Yeah, I think Leslie was the next slide.
All right.
So engaging those producers, I mean, I think we've all worked with farmers, so figuring out the number of producers served through programming and markets, you know, what makes sense, identifying those entities. I mean, you guys have been very fortunate to be able to develop models in West Virginia that really allow you to have these deeper relationships with some of the transactional partners. So any entities who work directly with producers. I noticed that Darlene from Farmers Market Coalition has been on the call this morning. I mean, there's great best practices in terms of collecting farmers market data. And I would say that if anything, farmers are becoming more acclimated to the nonprofit practitioners or social enterprises really wanting to aggregate this data. So counting the number of producers or farm businesses your entity engages through programming or via sales. Chesterfield Produce Auction, for instance, in our neck of the woods, they've been up and running and managed by Rural Action for many years. So they've been both a nonprofit working as a value chain coordinator, but they also operate the social enterprise that they can collect sales data and aggregate. I think the challenge here is, you know, some of the information may overlap. So you need to use systems that pay attention both to what producers who are selling maybe through multiple market channels. So for instance, I'm sure in West Virginia, you have some producers who are selling maybe at a farm stand, they're selling at a farmer's market, they might be marketing to the Wild Ramp, and maybe they have some farm-to-table restaurants. So making sure that you're trying to create systems where you don't double count, I think can be quite challenging. You know, Andrew mentioned that earlier. A lot of times this is developing both relationships and very user-friendly surveys for farmers to fill out. I think what we've discovered over time is that oftentimes individual farm businesses, or even many of the larger businesses we work with here at ACENET, it might take a number of months before they have their year closed out. They might not always know what their sales are. For instance, if I went and asked a bunch of people this afternoon, they might not even be able to really put their finger on what their 2017 sales are. But if you're asking questions where they're going to be able to say, yes, I do break out some of this information in my accounting systems, or no, I don't, having that information is really helpful. So what does this measure? Well, it really shows both individual and social capital. It allows us to see sector growth, hopefully momentum. I think we sort of have that anecdotally, that momentum is happening. But the more growers we can count entering the local food economy, that demonstrates that there is a lot of social capital within our sub-regional networks. Next slide.
Is Annie with us? Annie Stroud?
It looks like Annie's unmuted. So I think there's so many different examples in West Virginia. And Annie, if you could maybe tell some stories from Sprouting Farms recent work, that would be fantastic. And hopefully you're unmuted. The photos here again just demonstrate some of the nonprofit and farm incubator work that's already happening in West Virginia. So we have some, great photos that represent the Highland Market, Refresh Appalachia, individual farmer entrepreneurs who are really strong champions within your network. Sprouting Farms, obviously, one of the faster growing farm incubators currently in West Virginia.
I do not see, I see Annie on, but I think we might not be able to get her right now. So if we could go ahead and go to the next slide, and then we'll see if we can catch up with her and hear some more about her work with Sprouting Farms.
Right.
Does that sound okay?
Yep, let's just keep moving on. Hopefully we'll have a lot of time for chat here at the end of the webinar too. So food hubs and intermediaries. I mean, I think again, the indicators here, we certainly have more and more models growing throughout Central Appalachia. You have a lot of investment recently in West Virginia. So there's a growing number of transactional entities, making sure that those folks are engaged. Obviously, there's a lot of pilot project and other statewide actors. Hopefully they're already tracking some of the sales numbers. So whether it's a new food hub that's emerging, whether it's a great model like the Wild Ramp in terms of a larger producer association that's really moving forward on creating that retail environment for producers to interact with their customers. All of those count as places to collect data. I think of Move, I think of Greenbrier Grown. There's just a lot of different examples that you have. And I think what this demonstrates is that, the social capital is really important. Being able to animate that through metrics and through stories that show that this ecosystem of collaborating actors have really propelled the energy and the momentum of working together. West Virginia, in my estimation, over the many decades that I've worked with you guys, has really become much less siloed. There's a lot of additional built capital. You're, I think, doing a great job networking a lot of that shared infrastructure. And you're definitely, I think showing funders, many of who have already invested in a lot of this work, certainly through the ARC Power Initiative has been one great example. But you've had a lot of innovation with many of your foundations in the region. So being able to show funders, policymakers, and also the private sector that this work is organized, that you're taking it seriously by making sure measurements are important to you, and that you're sharing that data on an annual basis, just really mobilizes as I think all the partners within the local food value chains.
Hey, can anyone hear me?
And do we have Annie?
Can you hear me now?
There she is. Hello,
Yeah.
Annie. Welcome.
Hi. Sorry, I
Oh,
was having trouble with audio there.
that's okay. Do you want to jump in on slide 30 and give some examples about Sprouting Farms? I think we're still on this food hubs and intermediaries with Leslie.
Okay. On food hubs and intermediaries,
Yep, Leslie, are you still? Sorry.
Yeah,
So,
we can move. I think there's some photographs on the next slide, Liberty, or we can go back to the previous slide. And Annie, we just want you to really share some of the important work that's been happening with your project. Certainly the Sprouting Farms.
Sure, yeah, for sure. So I heard part of, I think we're looking at the number of entities engaged slide, is that correct? I can't see the webinar anymore.
Producers engaged in the food system, just a slide with the pictures and there's some Sprouting Farms photos on there.
Yeah, sure. So this is one that when we kind of started the tracking project last year, you know, in the past, a lot of the collaborative work that's gone on in West Virginia was really focused around the food hubs. But what we realized this coming year is that we've got a lot of organizations that aren't necessarily acting as sales agents as well. You know, a lot of these kind of new farmer training programs like Sprouting Farms, we're getting started and kind of up and moving. And a lot of them are interacting with producers in a bunch of different ways. You know, both through providing direct educational workshops, sometimes providing resources for growing, providing land access, you know, providing connections and access to other resources and things like that. So when we did it last year, we kind of created this Producers Engaged that was really broad, that included folks selling through transactional entities as well as through workshops and other resources and things like that. You know, because for instance, at Sprouting Farms, our farm doesn't have a food hub itself. We're working very closely with a partner that's selling the product, but we do provide rental space for farmers. So we've had farmers, you know, come to the farm and rent there. We had apprentices on the farms. We had, you know, we wanted to count their engagement. We have mentor farms that are working with our apprentices. You want to count that as well. I'm not sure what the plan is for next year, but some of this stuff also, I think, relates to one of the metrics we're going to talk a little bit later too, that revolves around some of that like community social capital as well. But I do think it's important for, you know, these organizations to really track who's really using our services and how many farms and wannabe farmers are we actually reaching. Anything else?
Well, thank you, Annie. We probably could keep going. I'm just kind of watching time, making sure that we'll have enough time for either using the chat box or fielding questions here at the end. So number of entities engaged, you know, we talked a little bit about the pilot project and probably having some of the other partners within the pilot project, you know, talk a little bit about how collaboration has worked. Certainly 14 organizations across the state have already participated, and that it's already impacting 31 counties. But to be able to grow those numbers would be fantastic. And these are just a bunch of various pictures from some of the different organizations and some of the work that's happening.
All right, so let's talk employment and job creation. Again, this is language that we hear every day. All you got to do is pick up a newspaper or turn on the TV. People are talking about job creation and employment. So that's the metric. That's what we're trying to track. What's the indicator on the thing that we actually count? We think probably full-time equivalent jobs, or FTEs for short. again, because there are so many part-time or seasonal jobs that we've just used fractions to represent those, so that we're giving a big round overarching total for a number of jobs. Who does this make sense for? This one's a little bit trickier because this isn't information that you would necessarily have just from working with producers. This has to be sort of a special additional question. And so the best way to gather this information is for folks who are already working with farmers and gathering sales information, to sort of add a piece to their process to gather job numbers. And so the easiest way to do that is just to ask for those numbers if you already have some other form of intake paperwork or any sort of reporting that you do, or it could just be as simple as a question at the end of every growing season, if you're working with folks at a farmer's market or a produce auction or anything like that. Again, this is a place where it's a really important piece of data, and you don't want to spend too much time and energy on it. So one-on-one outreach, if you're having to call up every producer that you work with to get their job numbers, we've had to do that before within CAN. It's not the best way to do this work, and it's very time-consuming. Surveys sometimes work well, but we also always hear that farmers in particular are tired of doing surveys. So there's some way to avoid that one-on-one outreach and doing those surveys, and to use sort of existing tools, existing ways of communicating with farmers that you already have in place. That's probably preferable. And then you take the annual job numbers and you compare them year to year. So rather than asking farmers how many jobs they created this year, just ask them how many jobs they supported this year and compare it, ask them the same question next year and compare the difference. And that's how we've been doing, and we've been seeing some growth. If you can differentiate between year-round and seasonal jobs, that may be a little bit too much to ask, but there's a pretty big difference there between a growing season job and a year-round job. And then farmers make sure they count themselves. So oftentimes the principal operator of a farm won't think of themselves as being an employee, but they obviously are. They are working. It is a job for them, whether it's full-time or not. And so make sure that farmers are counting themselves. What this shows, this is one of the best indicators of individual capital. Individuals need jobs. Employment, job creation, capacity is one of the things that we really want to prove about the local food system, to say that this is a sector that is employing people and that is creating job opportunities, and we can compare that year to year to show how it's actually changing. And this is especially important to government funders. I mean, anybody with a power grant or any support from the Appalachian Regional Commission or any other federal funding streams, that is the number one thing that they want to know. So really, it's in everybody's self-interest to try to understand this. And then if we can add all that up and show collectively how many jobs we're supporting, that's going to be a really powerful number. So next slide, and I think Leslie's going to take this one on buyer purchasing.
One little thing, comment for collecting job numbers. You know, depending on what you're operating, sometimes you know that information. I mean, at AceNet, because we have a lot of tenants in our incubator facilities, or we're working with people on a weekly basis doing marketing assistance, we can get that number in terms of what people's year-end job numbers are. And I think the most important thing, I will just ditto Andrew, is making sure the food or farm entrepreneurs are counting themselves, because oftentimes they don't think of what they're doing as job creation for themselves or their partners or spouses. So in terms of the purchasing behavior of buyers, you know, a lot of us have tried to come up with projects, especially with institutional or wholesale buyers. There's certainly been in recent years a lot of activity around farm to school initiatives. So, you know, trying to figure out what makes sense for any of these transactional entities. You know, how do we connect more producers to schools, hospitals, universities, retailers, or other large-scale buyers? A lot of us, I know on this call, have been struggling with figuring out some of the distribution logistics to wholesale buyers. So counting the number of buyers, their type if possible. So when we say type, thinking about the different types of market channels. And then if you can get total purchase amounts. Gail gave that great example. One of the things I asked from the Wild Ramp last week was year-end 2017 data for some of our Ohio producers. Having that information available is fantastic. Here at AceNet, we met with the Ohio healthcare folks to really identify how we're going to get data from their either POS system or from their food service buying patterns. So the earlier that you build in, I think, those relationships with expectations on metrics, the better. So aggregated data, again, is very important. I think farmers want to make sure that their confidentiality is respected. Getting that direct sales, again, aggregating that in such a way may require either that one-on-one kind of higher touch interaction, but if there's surveys, even maybe digital surveys that people can go to be able to fill in some of that information, all the better. So what does this show? Well, certainly that intellectual capital. Oftentimes it might even demonstrate that unmet demand. Definitely when we're working, I think, with wholesale market partners, really understanding what they would like to insert more local or regional from the global purchasing patterns that they have is really important. So it demonstrates that there's mainstream interest in local food and that we're seeing changes in buyer and consumer behavior over time. The photo or the visual there is one of the graphics that AceNet and Rural Action has utilized in marketing and promotional materials for our Farm to Institution to School project, where we've been working with local farmers, partners like Hocking College's culinary arts program, and then getting some of the food that's produced at Hocking College or processed at Hocking College into our K through 12 schools within Athens County. So Liberty, maybe we could go to the next slide.
That's an awesome password.
Okay, community engagement and participation. And Andrew, I think I'm doing this one, but you maybe want to fill in some blanks here too, or we have some other partners on the phone who might want to talk a little bit about some of the examples here. But this is, for us as nonprofits, we're oftentimes tracking, the number of folks who might be attending workshops or webinars, participants in trainings, events, the one-on-one technical assistance we may provide. Making sense of the support organizations, the trainers, the business coaches. Many of us are working with other entrepreneurial networks that are providing technical assistance to our clients and networks. So knowing those TA providers, the other community groups who are partnering within the network. So a lot of this stuff is things that we're probably capturing already, maybe through different grant investments that we have in our annual programming. So counting the number of events, the participants, any participants then maybe receiving TA. I think, again, this sometimes maybe is challenging within our partnerships, but I think if we have good systems in place, we can alleviate maybe where overlap does occur. But this is, again, I think a broader measure that we're trying to demonstrate that there's a lot of social, intellectual, and political capital that results from this work. So that's what it's really showing, that level of community engagement. There's public support. Hopefully there's a growing understanding of our communities in food systems, and that in many ways we're creating a very homegrown regional local food movement. So who really cares about this? Well, certainly the folks in our communities, the farmers themselves, hopefully the customers who want to buy local, this is all going to be important to them. But certainly we want it to be important to funders and policymakers as well. That type of intellectual capital, I think, just really creates more information all along the value chain, from the producers or farmers all the way to the consumers. So next slide.
Oh, did you want us to talk on this one, Leslie?
Well, or do we have
Yeah.
to remember if we have photos in the next one?
I think that's
Yeah, if Annie would give some examples of Sprouting Farms and some of the workshops and the things you all are doing, and I think we had Gail from Wild Ramp to talk a little bit about what they're doing.
cool. All right. Yeah. So as far as kind of the community engagement, once again going back to that producers engagement, there's also this like greater community engagement too. So one of the things, Sprouting Farms just got started this year, so we don't have a lot of information kind of in place yet. But even just based on some of our kind of preliminary stuff that we've been doing some cooking classes and some more kind of community engagement focused classes, some for producers, some for the broader community, and I know that we've had around 200 folks go, and there's been a lot of overlap, of course, in the different workshops with the same people going, but kind of one of the ways I've been thinking about it is what we're looking there is we're kind of counting these like interactions with educational networking opportunities that are being created through our program, because it gets really tricky unless you wanted to count everybody's email to weed out exactly how many people attended. So that's kind of how we've landed on doing that. But I think it is, for us at least, really important, because part of what we also want to do is not only just track the producers that we're helping to see what the impacts are beyond that. And I think in talking about the impact of the project too, and our collective project, there's an opportunity to talk about those educational and kind of consumer awareness activities, health activities, things like that aren't directly related to selling, but are still really important to showing kind of the picture of a really healthy and engaged local food and food related community in your area, I guess.
Thank you, Annie. And then Gail, are you still with us to share a little bit about what's happening at the Wild Ramp?
Yes, one of the things that happened when the Wild Ramp moved from our original location, we were kind of in exchange for getting a free building, which was a nice thing. We had the task of doing a lot of community events for the city. So we do big festivals a lot, and it's really hard to track how many people. We're working on ways to think about doing that, maybe raffle tickets or somehow, but it's just a public space and people wander in and out. But we have several big festivals, and then we also do things like cooking classes and farm to table dinners and kids art projects and book signings and all those kind of seat swaps, just all those normal kinds of things that local food organizations would do.
Thank you. Thank you all.
All right.
So it looks like
food access. Yeah, I'll take this one. We're getting into some that probably won't make sense for every food system actor, but we still want to go through them because they're important. And for the folks that do have the capacity to track these things, there's some very good reasons to do so. So food access, most folks are probably familiar with that term, food access or food security. It's basically the ability of consumers to be able to find and afford and prepare and eat healthy, nutritious food. And so this is something that's of huge concern to all types of folks, public health professionals, funders, governments, and everybody else. So if we can track this, then it can be a powerful piece of the impact puzzle. And the thing that we probably want to track that's easiest to count are sales to low-income or food insecure consumers. So there's lots of data out there about what is a food desert, who is food insecure, things like that. But one of the best ways to show that you're helping to improve food access is to measure sales to low-income consumers. This makes sense for any transactional entities who are engaging consumers directly. So farmers markets, retailers, transactional entities like smaller stores, maybe not so much food hubs or others who are selling to wholesale retailers, but rather the entities that are actually engaging with consumers directly. And what those entities can do is they can just keep track of their numbers of sales using SNAP, WIC, and other incentive programs. There's a lot of farmers markets that have double dollars. There are other incentives like that, but then there's also just SNAP usage at any of these grocery stores, or WIC usage, which are benefit programs that the entities are responsible for tracking those sales numbers anyway. So again, this is a category where folks who are already tracking this information, it probably makes a lot of sense to talk about the impact that you're having on food access. If you don't engage with those sort of incentive programs, or you're not engaging directly with consumers, it probably doesn't make as much sense for you. What it shows, it's individual capital. This is about health. This is about individual and community level health. And it's showing that local foods, because they tend to be fresh and nutritious, are generally increasing health, increasing food security, and that those incentive programs, the SNAP and WIC and double dollars and everything else, are also helping local farmers. And I took a screenshot here of an op-ed that Savannah Lyons from Refresh Appalachia wrote a little while back, and she made that argument, which is a two-sided argument. First, SNAP helps people be healthy and access fresh, nutritious, local foods that are in an affordable way, but it also is driving economic development, because all of those dollars that are spent using SNAP or WIC at farmers markets or on local food retail outlets, that money is going to local farmers. So again, a two-sided impact here: economic impact and health impact, if we can track this food access piece. So any comments there, or we can go on to the next one?
Yeah, let's move on. So in terms of farmland conservation and sustainability, I mean, I think this is another one that might be important for some of our partners to track. The indicator often is acreage, so being able to track year from year what level of acreage in production. It could be you're tracking specialty crops. It might be livestock farmers, the number of acres that they have that they're grazing animals on. You know, oftentimes it makes sense to be able to capture this information from other producer groups. Perhaps there's co-ops that are already capturing some of these indicators. There might be grower associations or even support organizations. I know in Ohio, we've worked with the Farm Bureau in the past to be able to identify some shifts from year to year in the acreage numbers that they might be collecting. So how to collect, counting the number of acres in production, obviously the type of operation. You can narrow this or broaden this to the degree that makes sense. For us in Ohio, a lot of times we've been primarily capturing specialty crop and livestock acreage that's in operation. But you also might want to have some deeper information. You know, is a certain amount of that specialty crop production certified organic? How much of it is conventional? Are there other sustainable methods maybe being used? So, you know, looking at the different livestock sustainable methods that maybe are being practiced by farmers within your region is something that's important for you to know. So what it shows, certainly natural capital. You know, farmland is being conserved. Maybe farmland is increasing the amount of productivity from year to year. That's a number indicator that we've certainly seen grow in this part of Ohio. And then again, whether this is important or not, I think many of us want to make the case that many farmers, especially farmers that are becoming more economically self-reliant in our region, are adapting their practices. So they're incorporating more sustainable agricultural methods, and we see perhaps more value in encouraging folks to become GAP certified or certified organic. Next slide, Liberty. And I don't know if anyone else wanted to add to that one either. I'm kind of pushing us forward. So financial investment and viability. This is another indicator, I think, for many of us who are beholden to different economic development forms of investment, especially from some of the USDA or other federal grant funders. I think this is important measures that we might want to consider. It makes sense, definitely, for support organizations, for lenders, for investors, counting the number of investors and the amount invested in farms, perhaps investment in shared use or private processing facilities. So really accounting for any equipment, facilities, property, machinery purchases. This has been a very important one to ACENET, and I think has been a metric that has really helped us make the case and leverage both further private and public investment. Again, you know, this is oftentimes information that you might have to get one-on-one through the surveying of farmers on what they've invested into their operations in a given year. But it shows that more investment in financial and built capital is happening. I think, again, anecdotally, as we look across the region, we see that there's infrastructure growth happening. We see financial viability for more and more of these operators as they invest or have investments made for collaborative infrastructure. So if anything, it just harnesses and hopefully encourages more investment opportunity down the road. And the next slide, Liberty. So, you know, just some examples. I mean, you think of all the high tunnels that have been put up in recent years. Certainly, there's more and more farm incubation programs emerging throughout West Virginia. There's a lot of work at the regional level trying to crack that nut of distribution, both within states and within our subregions. I've got some recent pictures of a visit from Ben in Savannah to ACENET's Food Ventures Center. And then, you know, one of the leaders certainly that I like to crow about from Southeastern Ohio is Green Edge Gardens. They've partnered with Rural Action and ACENET to really become a learning center so that more folks from throughout the region can come and learn from their practices and the investments that they've made over time in their infrastructure. So it'd be great, Annie, if you want to maybe chime in a little bit here as well. Certainly the investments that have recently been made in Sprouting Farm, you're beginning to reap the benefits. Gail might also want to talk about the investments over the last 4 to 5 years to the Wild Ramp, and the fruits of that investment have certainly just mushroomed incredibly.
Gail, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. One of the things that I wanted to be sure and talk about in the webinar is the number of new businesses that have been created just as a result of having the Wild Ramp. And those new businesses, obviously, some of them were started with individual money and investment from private people. And we have over 30 new businesses, and some of them have grown to be quite large and provided a full-time job equivalent for at least one person So it's been really interesting to see some of the innovative new businesses that have started up as a result of having a market to sell these things. Annie?
Hey, folks. I don't have a whole lot of examples of this necessarily, aside from, I mean, we've had some, as far as how Sprouting Farms is tracking, like I said, we just got started, so we don't have a whole lot of final things. So we did have a lot of great opportunities where farmers that were on our space using our resources were able to really invest into building their businesses up, you know, on our space, getting the resources into their high tunnels and whatever they're renting there on the farm. And I mean, Sprouting Farms was also able to do on kind of like the larger scale organizational level, a lot of work with some area partners, including farmland protection boards and other partners like that, to get some pretty significant investment into developing local food system. I don't think I was prepped for this slide, so sorry, I didn't have any good examples ready.
No worries. I just figured we've got you and you're connected. We should ask any questions. Given all the technical challenges about audio that we've had today. So thanks, Annie.
This is Gail. One other thing I would add, I see the picture of the Briar Valley Groans truck. The Wild Ramp was recently gifted a used bread truck from the Heiner's Bakery, which is right across the street from us. So we've had tremendous, since we started, investment from the community into our market in terms of infrastructure like freezers, display freezers for selling meat, walk-in coolers, just all different kinds of things that people, some individuals, some companies have donated and helped us by investing in our market.
I just realized I'm typing and I didn't mute myself. But I think, you know, what we're prepping ourselves up for, and Andrew and other folks can fill in now, is really getting ready for next week's webinar, where I'm sure we will have absolutely no technical difficulties, folks. But to have maybe some questions through the chat box in preparation for the last couple minutes here on the webinar would be great as well.
Yeah, so real quick, we do want to open this up for Q&A, and you know, we can take the remaining 15 or 20 minutes. And we just wanted to say that, you know, we broke this up into 2 webinars. This was already a lot here today, and so we just wanted to make sure folks were aware of. There's a whole nother set of things that we didn't even try to tackle today, and that we're going to talk more about next week. So if you have questions related to these things, that's the discussion we're going to be having next week. Norms and guidelines for collecting information. So we talked about all the different pieces of data, but how do you actually, how should you think about how to engage producers? How do you communicate, things like that? Practical tools and software options. So we'll share some examples of sort of what a data collection template might look like. And then on the other side, on the flip side, how do you actually use this data once you've got it collected? How do you communicate? How do you talk about the impact? How do you share these things with different audiences? And then we'll talk more about the next steps for the West Virginia pilot project as well. So there's a whole other set of conversations next week. And then if you go to the, let's see, I think next slide or the following slide, we've got some links for more information, and then we can do a Q&A here on this call if folks want to enter your questions into the chat box. I think we're going to try to do it that way rather than unmuting everyone. But Liberty, kick it back to you to handle the Q&A.
Sure. Yes, we just figured that might be the easiest way to manage any questions that you all might have, and that way we can also follow up with you if we aren't able to get the question answered on the call for some reason. But we do have a lot of people on the call today, and it might get a little hectic if we unmute and try to do it that way. But if you're not on your computer and not able to enter a question and you do have one, please do speak up and ask your question, and we'll do our best to answer that as a group. And just thank you all so much again for being with us today and being patient and hanging in there with us during our technical issues. We really apologize for all of that, but thankfully, you know, I just appreciate all the speakers and everyone that contributed, and all of you for being here. So does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask while we have all these folks with great knowledge on the call today to share their experience with us? So we do have a question from Leslie. She is asking, wondering what folks are already currently collecting data-wise. Does anyone have any feedback about that to share with the group? If so, please feel free to speak up.
Hi, this is Tootie.
Hey, Tootie Jones.
Hi. I have a little meat shop. So we are working with 22 producers right now, 14 meat producers and other producers. But we're using a system called ShopKeep, which has been really, really helpful for tracking everything, cost, price, margins, producer information, right down to how many pounds of what cut. So we're redoing our entire business plan, but it's really been helpful as a shop owner to be able to access this information at any given point and send it right off to that producer to answer their questions, but it's helping us track a lot of data.
That's great, Tootie. And I'm sure most people know, you know, Tootie has been a real leader within West Virginia in terms of your local food movement. And the Swiss Level Fine Meats is just another great example of the financial investment that has been made. So Tootie, I'm really excited to hear that even since I visited with you probably early fall, that it sounds like you're working with even more producers than you had in the middle of the year. That's great news. Are you tracking many of their agricultural practices, or is that something that you're asking your producer partners to disclose to you?
Yes, their practices right down to their feed source. In fact, we're getting ready to hone that in a lot more for this next season. I've just finished a whole survey, but I'm not sending out a survey. That's one-on-one conversations. And that's customer demand. So I'm really listening to our customers, what they want and how they want it. So it's helping us more clearly define the producer that we want to work with and the people that fit into that. It doesn't work for everybody, but it's at least we can go back and say, you know, for eggs, we sold X amount of dozen eggs and could have sold this many more, but this is what the consumer is looking for. So I'm starting to look for the producer that wants to step up, just like the vegetables. It's just sort of on the meat end and meet the demand. So yes, we question everything, even environmental practices, water practices, land, and then of course you need to be nice people to work with, so that helps a lot too. Those personal relationships go a long way when you're the face of their product.
Well, that's wonderful.
Thank you, Tootie, for sharing with us. What's that? Someone have a question? Faintly.
Okay, this is Parween with the Farmers Market Association. I'm not sure if you. Hi, thanks for having me. I wanted to let you all know some of the things that we track with our census. With the farmers markets, we get their total annual sales, locations, whether they accept senior vouchers, SNAP, EBT sales. We get information on their market managers, whether they are full-time, part-time, how much they compensate them, and where that funding comes from, whether they have rules in place, whether they have liability insurance, and whether their vendors have insurance, how much their booth fees are, and things like that. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that we ask them. We try not to make it too intrusive, and we try to make it very quick and walk them through the survey, but we do ask our members to take, 5 or 10 minutes of their time to work with us to try to get together this information so that we can use it not only for grant funding, but really for to help them and compare trends and see where things are going and where we need to really pitch in and offer training and do those kind of things.
And so you're also tracking training interests and training needs as well?
Yes.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. That's a whole other set of indicators that we hadn't really heard all about yet.
I just wanted to share that there's a comment in the chat box from Sam that says they track sales, including SNAP senior voucher breakdown through Farmers Register and produce grown and dollar value by the farms.
Farmers Register, I'm curious, is that like a software? We've heard about a couple of ways of tracking so far. A couple of those methods that Andrew was speaking to that we're going to cover next week. So it'd be interesting to gather a few more of those for our presentation next week. So I'm wondering if Farmers Register is a software program or some sort of method for tracking.
Excuse me, this is Gail. I have a question for Parween. Do you guys publish that information now, or is that just something that you use for internal purposes?
Usually for our members, and we're happy to share it. Obviously not individual folks' information, but we do aggregate it and we present it at the Small Farms Conference every year. But we are also happy to work with other organizations and share that data wherever it may be helpful to folks working in this area.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and just to add, this is Mary. We did, with the initial pilot project year, we did work with the Farmers Market Association to see how we could represent that aggregated data in the pilot project as well for the farmers market, so that since the Farmers Market Association is already doing that work to collect that, we wanted to amplify that as well within this broader picture. So we do hope to continue to work in that way going forward to make sure that that is reflected as well, since you all are doing that work, and there's no need to bother farmers markets twice. So thanks.
So Mary, this is Gail again, just to make sure I understand, the farmers market sales data was included in the pilot project numbers?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. Thanks.
But I'd have to, maybe Parween can check on that and confirm with us, but I do know we were working with Erica on that.
Okay, so, but we didn't then include the pinpoints on the map for each farmer's market that contributed to those sales?
Good question. Gonna have to check that one.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments from the folks that are still hanging in on the phone? How about any closing comments from any of our presenters today?
I'm really excited about with all of this kind of stuff is, that story of what collectively we can tell. This is a quick example from there's a West Virginia incubator farm and training program network. And yeah, this wasn't part of the pilot project we didn't get through, but Gabby at Food and Farm Coalition, who had to hop off so that I could get onto the audio, who isn't here to talk about it, but she sent out a quick kind of like baseline survey to the incubator farm members earlier this year, and I was really excited to look at it a couple days ago. And we have these new training programs that people don't know about, but one thing that's really exciting is when we look at our collective data, just from I think 4 or 5 respondents listed having trained and having like apprentices or crew members in their programs, we have like about 33 people listed. And I think that those stories are the ones that are so important and so exciting, is when we start tying it to actual people, because it's a lot easier for me to imagine the impact of 33 people learning how to farm than it is that there's 4 or 5 training programs. So that's really exciting, and I'm looking forward to learning more next week.
Wow, that is awesome, Annie. Thank you for sharing that number. It's exciting to think about 33 potential new farmers in West Virginia going forward around the state, and the implications of that, you know, as they start selling into the various markets that we are all building. So that's super exciting. Well, folks, we're getting close to 1 o'clock. We promised we would let you go. So I just want to thank everyone again for participating today. If you were an attendee, thank you for being with us for the whole time. If you were a speaker or presenter, thank you so much for lending us your time and your experience on this topic. And again, please, everyone, consider joining us next week for part 2 of this webinar series, where we're going to dig in a little bit more about, you know, just practical, easy ways to collect this data, and then how to shape that into something that you can use as you're communicating with your community, potential funders, in policy and advocacy work, et cetera. So thank you again to everyone. We will we are recording this, and we will send that recording out, and possibly the webinar presentation as well. And we'll do the same again next week. And then, as was mentioned earlier, there might be a short survey for participants following up from this, just to see, to gather your information if you would like to take part in the West Virginia pilot project, the metrics tracking pilot project for our next round, which will be happening very soon. We would love to have anyone participate that's interested in that. And then, yeah, we'll also be following all of this up with a report and some talking points and sort of a wrap up of the whole series to aid you as you go forward in your metrics tracking journey. So thanks again to everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week.
Thanks, Liberty. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.